So just before I continue, I want to remind you to actually keep your comments to the end of the video, just because I've done around about 4 weeks of looking into this issue, and so I really wanted to provide a fulsome view for you, and if you comment too early, your question might actually be answered during the video. So I know it's long, bear with me. This is also where things do get dark, so this is a bit of a warning for you as well. So I won't be showing any graphic imagery, but there is discussion about human trafficking, guerrilla tactics, abhorrent working conditions, and that's not even getting started with the environmental issues or the animal abuse. So just a warning, I promise that we will get through this and it will get better, but I do want to provide a fulsome view of exactly what has actually been going on, because it's really important to actually know, otherwise you're not being an informed consumer. Why would we even need to actually monitor what happens on palm oil plantations? You can actually ask that same question about why you'd need to monitor any raw ingredients sourcing, like honestly, because if you really want to go on a dark journey, just look into what happens for cotton, rice, tea, bananas, surprisingly, and pineapples, and basically anything that could be sourced from a more tropical location, aka a lot of places where it might be a little bit less developed than in the first world, where exploitation is easier. Yeah, it's really hard to buy anything ethically. So that's why it's really important that we do actually have these watchdogs, actually making sure that people are doing the right things, treating people well, and generally trying not to destroy the environment, animals, and the way that people want to live. So one thing I really want to raise here is that we should not be judging the people that are actually sourcing these ingredients. We should not be judging the people that work on these farms, because they are honestly mostly in really dire situations where they're just doing what they can to survive. And so if we were living in these sorts of conditions, if we were fleeing from one country to the other because we were in a war-torn country, we were in a really bad situation, we would be okay with doing all of this stuff too. Even from a psychological standpoint, if Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if we just break it down to something super basic, most of these people aren't actually having their basic needs met on that lower tier. And if you or I were in the same position, we would be doing the same thing. We would literally just be trying to do what we can to survive. So I can understand, even though I can never really understand myself because I'm a very privileged person, I say in a house that we own, we just need to provide understanding to them and provide protection for them as opposed to judging them. That's not what we should be doing. We should be trying to put things in place to actually make sure that these people are taken care of. Like that's where it's really important. Manipulative tactics are often used on natives in order to get them to release land or even just work on these palm oil plantations. And a lot of these people can no longer live a nomadic life because of these palm oil plantations. They're either driven out of where they normally live or driven into a situation that is really bad, or they're surrounded by palm oil plantations, so they actually have to work on the oil palm plantation anyway. I will dive into this a bit later on. A lot of the people that actually work in oil palm plantations, they're not even from the country where they are working, because a lot of the time people are actually sent there through human trafficking. Like I mentioned before, this has actually been the case with Colombia, for example, which we will dive into in a little bit, but you have people that are from a country that is completely war-torn in a really bad situation. They have to go to somewhere like Ecuador. So they're often tricked from being in one country in turmoil to going into a terrible situation where they literally have got no way to get out of it because their passports get taken, they've got no paperwork, they've got no traceability of this labor broker that actually hired them. You're in a really bad situation, and you're also in the situation where they have as many workers as they could possibly want. You're basically worthless unless you can perform well and you shut up. Basically the complete power dynamic, it's just gone. So all of the power is with the people that own these plantations, the people that police the plantations, because that's scary. You as a worker, you have no say, you have no right, and you're literally at the whim of these people, because oftentimes they actually control your housing and the food that you get too. You're dealing with all of this at the same time as dealing with really dangerous chemicals with no PPE provided. So you're not being equipped with the correct gear to handle the fertilizers, the pesticides, and you're also dealing with like really dangerous working conditions. If you actually fall out of favor with the person that owns the plantation, they'll either just dock your pay, put you on a worse job, which often happens to the women actually, because they already get paid less and oftentimes they get made to do the more mundane jobs. women are tended to be thought of as being weak, therefore they do the worst job. And also, if you've actually just angered the person that owns the plantation or the people that are running the show, they can literally just send you away and get someone else to work on the oil palm plantation because they don't need you there because they have an abundance of workers that will easily take your place. Let's just have a look into how people are actually hired to work on these oil palm plantations. A lot of the time, like I mentioned before, it's from human trafficking, or they're literally just trying to get a job to be able to send money back to their home because their home, they desperately need it. So when you're desperate, you'll basically take whatever job you can get. Verite are a really incredible NGO, and they've actually done some case studies on this, so I'm just going to be referring to a couple of them throughout this, but there is a big report which I will link down below, same as all of the resources that I'm referencing in this. There are many case studies about this from Verite that show people who fled Colombia were tricked by their labour brokers, luring them into jobs with far worse paying conditions than they were expected to get. Palm workers were reportedly paid as little as a sixth of the amount originally promised to them and were forced to work overtime, sometimes without pay. Workers also faced limits on their freedom of movement and communication, including curfews, constant surveillance, supervision by armed guards. Workers also were dependent on their employees, not just for their incomes, but also for their food and shelter, which also restricted their ability to be able to leave. So furthermore, some workers fell into debt due to deductions for the food and housing that were often of poor quality as well. So when they are told that they're going to be paid a certain amount each month and also given food and also given shelter, the food and shelter is docked out of that pay, but then how can you actually rely on how much is coming out of that pay? You don't know what the rent is at this place, even if there is rent to pay, and you don't know how much the food is worth. You could obviously live a lot cheaper having your own place, but a lot of the times you're just crossing the border into the complete unknown. There are also reports that employers withheld workers' wages and threatened workers with physical violence, reporting of undocumented workers to authorities, and worsening of already poor working conditions in order to prevent them from seeking assistance or protesting unfair treatment. Verita's research also uncovered additional problems facing palm workers. These risks include wage, benefit, working hour violations, child labour, discrimination against women, discrimination against Indigenous people, and also discrimination against people of African descent, health and safety risks, poor housing, environmental damage, harm to Indigenous communities, and inadequate grievance mechanisms. It's not a nice situation to be in all around. But this is just another case study. So in Ecuador, there was an Indigenous Colombian who had his farm stripped of all of its produce, and this was actually following a similar pattern to what happened to his neighbours, who had all gone mysteriously quiet and then just suddenly left where they lived. Because the neighbourhood where he lived in, it was actually all family-owned farms, so it's like you grow your own produce, you sell that on as well, so therefore you can make a living, right? What happened to him was one night he had a knock on the door and it was 5 guerrilla fighters. He was given 2 options, either enlist with them or turn over his land. Turns out that they'd done the same thing to his neighbours. The threats increased in frequency after he did not give them a direct answer, and his farmland was plundered nightly. He started receiving death threats 2 days later, and this is a really worrying thing because 2 of his children, he had 5 kids, but 2 of them were directly threatened by these guerrilla fighters with their life. I think we can all gather where this would go if he didn't flee, because he had to flee, obviously. Like, 1, you're gonna get no profits because of your land, but 2, your life is literally at risk. So he then went across the border to San Lorenzo in Ecuador, trying to look for work, but this is another issue, is that many locals actually refuse to give Colombians work. So if you're a darker skinned person, you get treated even worse. So he met a recruiter who offered him and his 2 eldest sons, who were their late teens, work on a palm plantation and to pay them $300 a month and with decent housing and food. But when they arrived, they were housed in a small room with 9 other men and only 6 beds. And the only drinking water provided was from a well that was infested with trash and insects. Not only this, but the cost of the housing and food were deducted from their sub-minimal wages, and there is little to no way out as these labour brokers do not have signed contracts, no records, and nothing. Of course, your passport is most often taken for safekeeping. It's literally just human trafficking, and this is very common. So most of the oil palm around the world is actually from Southeast Asia. It's around about 85 to 90% of it is sourced from there. I know that Ecuador isn't like the biggest deal, but it's a growing industry, and because it's very profitable, because you don't have to have many workers on it, which we're just going to get into, that's where you have even more issues growing. Let's have a look into the labour force. For the African palm plantations, so that's cultivation and harvesting. So this is actually an extremely labour intensive activity, and this actually provides most of the jobs in the palm oil sector. However, it differs from plantation to plantation. There is normally only one worker needed for every 25 acres of land. So despite the low ratio of workers to land and advances in technology and efficiency, most jobs on palm plantations are actually provided by extremely large estates that require a large number of workers. Due to their isolation, most estates must hire temporary workers during peak harvest and are reliant on outsourced labour. And this is where the labour broker shadiness comes in. Because instead of the company itself actually hiring people, they enlist labour brokers, so this has provided them a loophole to not provide any benefits to these people that the labour brokers actually hire. So the labour brokers get a cut of everything as well. And then you've got the company over here, which just barely has to pay anything. They don't have to worry about medical expenses. They don't have to worry about correct housing, board, health and safety, things like making sure that there's no child labour. They don't need to worry about any of that stuff because they are enlisting to a third party. You have these labour brokers that are actually on the company payroll, so they often actually lure men, women and children with enticing offers of high wages, easy work and promising living conditions. There are actually reports in the industries in both Malaysia and Indonesia that actively violate labour rights. So migrant workers are forced into debt by profiteering labour brokers. Even local people have actually become victim to all of these exploitative labour practices. There are an increasing number of smallholders that actually fall into these debt traps because they take out these loans to these people. So children also fall victim to this. So that is why the US Department of Labour has actually listed palm oil sector as one of the worst offenders for forced child labour and also forced labour in general. So it's clear that there are many issues that are actually happening, which is why we need to have these reports. We need to know the truth so then we can actually enforce change. Let's move on to displacement. This is an issue that directly affects the people that actually are native to the country and live in the country, and they get forced out of where they live. So one of the key things to know is that you need to have free, prior and informed consent from the locals. So that means that you can't force anyone to move. You have to make sure that they are aware of what is going to be happening. They are aware that they're selling their land or they're moving elsewhere or they're going to start working on the oil palm plantation. Basically the same way that you have to get consent from a council in order to build around you. So say for example an apartment block is going up next to you, they'd need to check that sort of stuff with you. You know what I mean? It's the same sort of concept, except for the fact that you have these people that probably won't be able to understand all of the legal jargon that is actually included in this paperwork that they're just given. I mean, hell, I can't even understand a lot of legal documents. Like, how are these people meant to understand that when they're living their natural nomadic life that they want to continue to lead? So what palm companies have actually been able to do is actually buy up this land that is actually recognised by the government as ancestral Indigenous land. We all know what's happened to the poor Native Americans. It's even happened here in New Zealand. It just should not happen. People should be allowed to keep their land, and I don't know why there'll be a controversial thing to say, but apparently it is. This is just another report from Guerilla. So according to the WRM, after being deceived or pressured to sell their land whilst its value is inflated due to the presence of palm plantations, many Indigenous groups must leave their ancestral lands, moving to other Indigenous communities, nearby towns, large cities, virgin forests, which they then have to clear to build housing and make a living, which also creates a lack of wood for building homes and canoes, and it also results in the disappearance of traditional medicine plants, wild fruit and game, which can lead to malnutrition and health problems. And like I mentioned before, if you don't want to sell your land, you just get surrounded by these palm oil plantations anyway, so then that kind of forces you to have to work on them, because where you would actually get your food from before, that's been taken away, because now you've just got these oil palm plantations where you don't really have animals living there, you don't have any other vegetation there, there's no space for you to be able to grow crops. You're literally just surrounded by these trees and there's nothing you can do about it, and there's nowhere for you to go, so then you end up taking a job with that person anyway, whereas you could have made more money by selling the land and then having to give up all of your freedoms as a person. It's bad. I told you it would be bad. So I mentioned before that there are a lack of jobs and opportunities as well. So let's just have a bit of a comparison with different crops and how many days of labour they actually provide. Whilst it's a good thing to have crops which are easier to grow and cheaper to run, it's also a bad thing in terms of job security if you just have a monocrop over the place and you don't have other job opportunities for these people. If it's just relying on this one thing, that's where the issue is. It's great from an economic standpoint, but it's not good for people's livelihoods. So let's just have a look at different crop comparisons. The palm sector, so that generates around about 21 days of work per acre per year, whereas for chili peppers that's 75 days, for green and red peppers it's 53 days, for limes it's 46, for corn it's 45, for yucca it's 36, and for land planted with both rice and corn it's 32, and 23 for beans. The only sector that actually produces less jobs is the cattle industry, which is a whole other kettle of fish when it comes to environmental damage. So the fact that it's taken over so much of the land and actually kind of displaced people, and it doesn't require many people to work on it, this has actually become an even bigger issue in Ecuador, in particular in Esmeraldas, because there used to be all of these family farms around, whereas now it's actually just mostly made up of all of these palm oil crops. The fact that you have around about one job for each hectare of land is really bad, because this has actually meant that the number of jobs available has decreased. Therefore, people are left in far more desperate conditions, which means that if one person that's currently working on the palm oil plantation, and the fact that they can no longer work there, the fact that they don't want to deal with the rubbish that they're having to deal with now, the fact that they've probably gotten injured, they can just go and be replaced by a long line of other people that still need jobs. So for Colombians, like I mentioned before, they're actually in a worse state because they actually don't even have job opportunities elsewhere. So you can't work at a cafe or anywhere else that you might be able to. The only other option for Colombians tends to be in the fishing industry, and that's where you get into a lot of people smuggling, drug smuggling, far more dangerous conditions. You're vulnerable to pirates, and also just drowning and just getting lost at sea. Yeah, the fishing industry is actually worse than the palm oil industry, and the palm oil industry is already really bad. Yeah, like I said earlier on, if you are trying to buy ethically, it's a hard time. Now that you know about some of the human issues, let's have a look at the environmental ones instead. So all of what I'm actually going to cite right now is from National Geographic. Was actually written in 2017. I know it's a few years old, but it's only 3 years old, okay guys? Come on, like. So obviously we know that worldwide the demand for palm oil actually continues to rise because it is such a versatile fruit. India uses around about 17% of the global total, followed by Indonesia, Europe and China. So Europe is a bit more to do with biofuel. That's actually also ramping it up because obviously that was seen to be a greener alternative to actually using petrol or diesel. In case you're wondering, USA ranks 8th, and that was in 2017 in terms of usage. And in 2018, the global consumption was expected to reach 72 million tons, or around about 20 pounds of palm oil per person. Yum! I guess when you take into account just how many products palm oil is in, it kind of makes sense. I mean, if you're using a shampoo or moisturizer that uses that, like, you think about how much that weighs, that's pretty heavy. If you think about like all of the food that's in, like so much food, like if you're eating biscuits, cookies, pizza, oh god, it's in so many things. I'll just flash up on the screen right now the amount of things it's in, but it is in so much. So I guess that does actually make sense. And that's even with people trying to boycott it back then. Like, that's a lot. So obviously supply and that demand has taken on a huge toll. Since 1973, around about 16,000 square miles of rainforest on Borneo alone has been deforested to make way for palm oil. In order to actually clear the way for palm oil, you oftentimes like bulldoze it and also burn it, so then that's also obviously releasing the carbon into the atmosphere, so that's why burning doesn't happen anymore. At least it doesn't happen if you are a certified place, you can't do that. And this is the kicker, so that's 16,000 square miles. That accounts for the 1/5 of the total deforestation on Borneo since 1973, and for 47% since 2000. Obviously we know how bad deforestation is because when you're actually taking forest out, you're also weakening the land, and then the amount of pesticides that are needed to be used for all of these monocrops as well You're having that going into the waterways. So there's a multitude of issues around the pollution that is actually created by tearing down, well, effectively rainforests hold on to so much carbon for the planet, and then they also release so much oxygen. By taking that away, you are severely hindering the Earth's ability to breathe, so to speak. I mean, I know that a lot of times, like, the rainforest is referred to as like the lungs of the planet. It is super important, and of course that does also bring us onto the animals. So nearly 150,000 critically endangered orangutans on Borneo were actually perished from 1999 to 2015. I do just want to say, like, the main culprits are actually logging and hunting in order for them to have all died, which is horrific. But palm oil was still a major factor because you're still clearing their homes, you're still clearing where they actually get food from, like how they actually live, because orangutans, like, they need to not only have like just one patch of land, they need to have the connecting lands, and that's not just for orangutans, that's for so many animals. Like, they need to have spaces to be able to go, and so it's like you go to different points in the river, you want to be able to like actually go and mate, like, because you're not just in this one little sector, it's not like this little Tinder hot pot that you're in. You need to have that space to be able to go around. So whenever you're seeing these companies actually just put in like one blob of forest and then you surround it with palm oil with nowhere else for like these animals to be able to go here to there to connect, that really does hinder them massively. Just like in normal nature, there's all of those socio-economic things that are happening all the time, like there's all of those social interactions that are happening all the time, and when children grow up they need to find a new place to go. They don't have anywhere else to go if you're just cramping them in this one little spot. You know what I mean? So it's really hindering their own livelihoods when you're just putting one blob of forest there. That's basically what I'm saying, because they can't live how they would naturally live. So this also exacerbates climate change as well. So in Indonesia, the haze from the forest fires, which were oftentimes deliberately set in order to make way for oil palm plantations, it caused at least 12,000 premature deaths. And that's just in 2015. Now, things have changed since then, so you're not allowed to actually burn. How is this being policed? You know what I mean? Like, we need to really make sure that the watchdogs are really watching this stuff to make sure that things aren't getting burnt, that people aren't going to die from that. So there have actually been methods developed by scientists and NGOs that are experts in this field to support natural habitat and reduce environmental damage. So let's just look into that with a bit of a magnifying glass, because this is where things get a little bit more complex, if I'm completely honest with you. You might have actually heard of the RSPO, so that actually stands for the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil. They were actually founded in 2004, and I can just read this out directly from their website. We are a not-for-profit that unites stakeholders from the 7 sectors of the palm oil industry: oil palm producers, processors of traders, consumer good manufacturers, retailers, banks and investors, environmental and social NGOs, to develop and implement global standards for sustainable palm oil. So the RSPO has developed a set of environmental and social criteria which companies must comply with in order to produce certified sustainable palm oil, CSPO. So when they're properly applied, these criteria can help to minimize the negative impacts of palm oil cultivation on the environment and communities in oil-producing countries. The RSPO has more than 4,000 members worldwide who represent all links along the palm oil supply chain. They've also committed to produce, source and/or use sustainable palm oils certified by the RSPO. They've got all of their missions, which I'll just have on the screen for you right now, so you can hit the pause button and have a look. When you actually look at it, it sounds pretty good, right? Now, previously there have been issues with the RSPO because they used to only take an environmental stance, which meant that they didn't actually care about labour rights and child labour rights, aka not using child labour. So there have been many issues around that. So they have made changes to their criteria to allow for those sorts of human rights issues that you would have thought would be enlisted right from the start, maybe? Maybe? I don't know. Maybe it's just me. Maybe it's just me that would want to do that. Again, this is just from National Geographic. Plantations that are actually certified by the RSPO, they're not allowed to clear primary forests or areas which contain significant concentrations of biodiversity, e.g. endangered species, or fragile ecosystems. And they must minimize erosion and protect water sources. They must pay a minimum wage and get free, prior and informed consent from local communities. Now, it's the free, prior and informed consent bit that has been a bit dodgy, because the way that the RSPO has actually policed this in the past is basically rely on people to make complaints, and the way that they were checking to make sure that things were actually above board was to just see the paperwork that was provided to them, and unless you're actually going out into the communities, unless you're actually going on the ground, you can't guarantee. So that's why there have been issues with people that have been certified by them, because in the past they were not being strict enough with their requirements on issues around free, prior and informed consent. If you're not strict enough about that, then that's where you get issues like what happened with the Treaty of Waitangi, like what happened with so many things, because it's very easy to forge a document. It's not so easy for people to actually communicate with the locals, communicate with the government, and actually find out which areas are protected. So today, the RSPO actually certifies around about 1/5 of the world's palm oil supply. We've got some big fish in the sea right now. So Unilever, Nestle and Procter & Gamble have all pledged to switch all of their palm oil to be from RSPO certified locations over the next few years. Now, when that is going to happen, who knows? You can say over the next few years, it's like, oh yeah, I'll take out the trash at some point. The trash just keeps building up. And now we've got way more problems because you haven't taken the trash out. You know what I mean? It's the same sort of thing. It's like, if you just keep putting that banana peel on top, just keep going. It's like, no, because now you've got trash everywhere, and now you need to clean the carpet as well, and now you've got to deal with stains on the wall, and you've got to deal with all these other issues because you weren't acting fast enough. Here's a little bit of a story for you as well. So in Sabah, I'm sorry if I'm butchering that, I think it's Sabah, a group of scientists, activists, RSPO members and government officials are all trying to right past wrongs. They've actually come up with a palm oil and NGO, which is referred to as Pongo Alliance, which is an industry NGO coalition that aims to convert 5% of the biggest plantations on Borneo back to forest for orangutans. I'm gonna butcher this again, I'm really sorry. In Kinabatangan, over the past decade, they've actually planted over 100,000 trees of 38 species to try and preserve a corridor for wildlife along the river. And so I'll actually just show you all of the Google Earth images now, because you can really tell in this entire area where they've actually managed to get this work done, still allowing to let palm oil flourish. Whereas if you look at other areas of Borneo, you can really see where areas of the forest have just been hacked into in order for these not so approved palm oil plantations to exist, you know what I mean? It's like, if you have a controlled way of having palm oil plantations along with working with the environment in a more healthful way, that's where you'll get a much better outcome for the animals. I mean, like, if there is no way to stop the deforestation, if there's no way to stop the need for palm oil, if you're doing it the way that these guys have been, that's one of the most positive things to actually do, as opposed to just wiping out all of the land, which is what we've seen, and then you have a little lump of rainforest in the middle somewhere, which effectively is like giving all these animals and species like a death sentence. So like I mentioned before, the RSPO has not been without its controversies. There is this amazing agency called the Environmental Investigation Agency. I will refer to them as the EIA instead of the Environmental Investigation Agency, because that's too hard to say and I've been talking for a long time. I've actually read this entire report for you. I know, you're welcome, but you can read it down below as well. It's really, really interesting, very well done, and also dark and scary report, so warning before you read it. I do just want to say that there are good things that happen from companies that are watching the watchdog, so to speak, because the RSPO is meant to be the watchdog, but who's actually checking in on them to make sure that they're accountable? Because you can have people getting paid off, you can have a government putting pressure on them, you can just have people that don't really care all that much, or you can have people that don't really fully understand all of the impacts. That's why it's really important to watch the watchdog. This actually allows for transparency and improvements to be made, and improvements have been made with the RSPO, but they've also done some bad things. It's the same with any industry though. It's like anytime that people are kind of cagey about the way that they work, about how something is produced, there's normally something to hide there. It's like, you don't need to go listing all of your ingredients and all of like your trade secrets, but if you're not willing to let people see what you're doing in an unstaged way, like in an authentic way, it's like, this is just average day to day, then you're probably hiding something, and that's where I don't really trust things. So let's have a look at a case study, shall we? So when the EIA looked further into the RSPO certification process undertaken by Guerilla plantations, the first RSPO certified plantation in Malaysia's Sarawak state, they found a group of companies which obtained politically motivated land handouts and cleared large swaths of forest in Sarawak in Malaysia just prior to being certified. Profits from these RSPO certified Sarawak companies are now financing a web of new plantation companies at the expense of Peruvian forests. Over 13,000 hectares, mainly of primary rainforest, has been deforested by offshoots of this group in Peru. So Guerilla Plantations became a member of the RSPO on June 2nd, 2009 and received their certification of its 6,023 hectare plantation in Sarawak on October 1st, 2010. So this is actually despite the clearance of natural rainforest by the company in the years leading up to their membership. Guerilla Plantation has been selling their oil palm products as certified sustainable grower since that time. Almost 60%, which is 3,100 hectares, of Guerilla Plantation's currently planted oil palm was planted between 1998 and 2002. By cross-referencing maps and GPS coordinates provided by the company with satellite imagery from the United States Geological Survey, the EIA determined that massive clear-cutting of forest cover of Guerilla Plantation land occurred during the same period. The RSPO requires that an evaluation to determine whether the land planted for plantation contains high conservation value, which I will now refer to as HCV, area be carried out prior to new plantings. This is in an effort to prevent the destruction of primary rainforests or other important areas for conservation. The extent to which this resolves the problems that we've identified will only be clear when the recommendations are actually implemented. As the EIA tracks the expansion of the palm oil industry across new frontiers in Latin America and the Congo Basin, we'll be watching to see whether the RSPO can crack down on bad acts or whether abuses in new areas further threaten the scheme's credibility.
So that was a 2015 report. Here's a 2019 report that came out in November, much more recent and much more damning. So bullet point version, there are ongoing fraudulent assessments, auditors that are failing to identify all of the following things: Indigenous land right claims, social conflicts arising due to abuse of community rights, serious labour abuses, risks of trafficked labour being used in plantations, there's ambiguity over legal compliance, auditors providing methodology and substantively flawed high conservation value area assessments that will enable destruction of HCVS, certification bodies displaying weak understanding of the P&Z standard, certification bodies providing suspect assessments in response to legitimate complaints from NGOs which fails to address the substance of complaints, conflicts of interest due to links between certification companies and plantation companies. The issues that were raised that were meant to be fixed with 6H haven't actually been addressed properly, and only a few items have been. In July 2016, they put their assurance task force together who hope to be wrapped up by November 2016 and also provide a full report with systemic change recommendations. The task force that they put together seems to be entirely incompetent. They held their first meeting in November of 2016 when they were meant to be wrapped up, and the last known meeting was in 2018. No report has been produced, it was disorganised, people missed meetings, deadlines were rarely followed, communication was scattered at best, and minutes from the meetings were poorly taken, and as an EA myself, this all seriously irks me. It should not be this hard. So let's look at the progress that the task force made. Looking at this chart right here, green is completed, orange is partially completed, and red is not at all. I will just let you pause and zoom in on different areas if you want to throughout this. And going on to the 5 objectives, only one that has partially been resolved around free, prior and informed consent. So they even had the help of Verite assist them with Objective 4, which was monitor the quality and performance of auditors and pursue suspensions or sanctions against underperforming or persistent offenders, and they couldn't even get that right. As you can see, Verite were amazing, as what we explained before as well. There is an issue with RSPO members quitting the RSPO rather than resolving complaints, and this remains to be a problem and seems to disincentivize the RSPO from sanctioning members over complaints to minimize its risk of losing members. The RSPO has adopted a resolution in 2018 to try and discourage members with unresolved complaints from avoiding their obligations by divesting or membership withdrawal. It is yet to be seen how this can be implemented. The complaint system is also not transparent enough. So obviously we want as many people to get certified as possible in the correct way, and this will be a massive deterrent as well by being nitpicked or by being seen to be bullied or whatever. But as far as I'm concerned, honestly, the companies just need to pull up or shut up. It's as simple as that. So moving on a bit, there are a number of case studies that show multiple facets of failure that the RSPO has done. I won't go through them all, but the document is actually linked down below. The RSPO has made improvements, so it is really important to say that. However, they've got a long way to go, and their track record for taking action is slow and scattered at best. The new PNC in 2018 is considered a significant improvement over the previous version, yet they can only attain their full potential if they can be audited and upheld in a thorough, comprehensive and competent way. If we can get anything from that task force that they put together, competent might be a stretch. The newly created Assurance Steering Committee, which is now a permanent fixture within the RSPO, must take up the challenge with renewed vigour and credible action. The RSPO's new watchword must become enforcement.
Now it's time for us to look at HCV, which is high conservation value and the high carbon stock approach, because this is something that has actually been implemented fully. So this is all from the High Carbon Stock Org website. I'll be showing it on the screen now for you. So the HCSA, High Carbon Stock Approach, tropical rainforests hold large stores of carbon and biodiversity and are critical for millions of Indigenous and local people who depend on forests for their livelihoods. However, carbon is released and biodiversity is lost whenever the forests are cleared, otherwise known as deforestation. The high carbon stock approach is a methodology that distinguishes forest areas for protection from degraded lands with low carbon and biodiversity values that may be developed. So the methodology was developed with the aim to ensure a practical, transparent, robust and scientifically credible approach that is widely accepted to implement commitments to halt deforestation in the tropics, whilst ensuring the rights and livelihoods of local people are respected. The amount of carbon and livelihoods actually stored in an area of land depends on the type of vegetative cover. The HCS approach stratifies the vegetation in an area of land to 6 different classes using analysis of satellite data and also ground survey measurements, because you can only tell so much from above. It's actually going on the ground, talking to the people, seeing actually what's there. That's where the critical stuff actually happens. So the 6 classes are high density forest, medium density forest, low density forest and young regenerating forest, scrub, and cleared and open land. So you've got all 6 of those, and the top 4 are actually protected. So if you are wanting to clear scrub and cleared and open land, you're fine. But the young regenerating forest, which I think is really important to point out, you're not allowed to clear that. That's critically important because obviously those are the new plantings to ensure that they can actually grow and actually sustain more life and livelihoods, and it's really important that we're still replanting these rainforests. So along with obviously assessing all of that, they also insist on getting the free, prior and informed consent of people, and they actually make sure that that is fully integrated into all of the approval processes. It's really, really in depth, and it's very, very good that they've actually done this. And they always make sure that people that are fully trained in how to actually conduct these are actually on these evaluation panels and the assessment panels and the auditors. It's really important that you've got people that are fully educated in this in order to make sure that people aren't just doing a over-the-top sort of job, that they're not just committing fraud in order to do this. It's really important that you're actually taking on this scientific approach and making sure that you've got all of these very clear categories to follow, because then that means that you're less likely to cause more damage and you're more likely to have a much better environment, not only for the animals and the environment but also the people that are there, the natives that are there. So what effectively happened was there was a HCV and HCSA assessment in the past, and they actually got combined into one. This was in 2017, so then that means that the way that things were measured before 2017, you have a different set of criteria to follow, but now ever since 2017 you have a one set of criteria to follow, so then it's a lot clearer for people, it's more scientifically backed, and it means that you're actually doing better for the people, the planet and the environment. So the change that was made in 2017 is incredibly positive and important, and I don't think that without reports done by places like Veritas and the EIA, I don't think that you would actually get sorts of improvements like this. So now that wraps up all of the dark side of the palm oil industry, the greenwashing that's happened, the deforestation, the devastation to the environment, to the people, to the animals, human trafficking, all of that grim stuff that is done. Now we're actually going to move on to the scientific side of it, of whether palm oil can actually be sustainable, or if it's literally just greenwashing.